All right, this week's challenge was to write something that generates something. So the thing I thought of was John Conway's Game of Life. John Conway was a mathematician who, in October 1970, submitted an article to Scientific American about a automata who could generate life forms, basically. And it's sort of was based off on Neumann's machine, but it was very had very simple rules and a very simple concept. But it just shows that a simple rule set and a simple concept can generate infinite complexity. So the rule is how it works is there are cells on a grid of an infinite size. For this case, it's 20 by 24, but could be infinite or supposed to be infinite. And a cell has two states. It's either on and alive or off and dead. So on this screen, ignoring the cursor, there are 4 live cells. And how the rules work is this. There's really only 2 rules. The first rule is if there is a cell that is bordered and the cells that border it are the horizontal, the vertical, and the 4 diagonals, so there's 8 possible neighbors for every cell. If an empty cell has exactly 3 neighbors, it will generate a new cell in that spot. If a cell is already alive or turned on, it will stay alive if it has 2 neighbors or 3 neighbors. So the upshot of that is, the corollary rules to that is a cell that has less than 2 neighbors will die of loneliness, and a cell that has more than 3 neighbors dies of overcrowding. So when you create a beginning, create a beginning shape like this, and then you set the machine in motion. And generally, one of 3 types of things will happen. The first is that it will eventually evolve into a steady state pattern, one that never generates any new cells, and none of the cells that are there die. Another example, if I take almost the same shape and just move that one cell over one, the other thing that can happen to a pattern of cells is that eventually they will die off. Another thing that can happen is, again, I'll take pretty much the same shape and move this over one. Another thing that can happen is eventually these shapes will turn into oscillating patterns that will go indefinitely. When he wrote the article in 1970, Conway had a $50 challenge. You could tell it was 1970. He had a $50 challenge to anybody who could come up with a pattern of cells that would continue to grow infinitely or change infinitely, so they wouldn't die or wouldn't devolve into set patterns. And some people at MIT actually won that prize before it's over. I'm just going to demonstrate. This is another one that will evolve into a oscillating pattern. And these actually have names, so what this one eventually turns into, so now it's hit after 15 generations, it turns into its oscillating pattern, and it will stay oscillating in this pattern forever. This one they call the Pulsar. I'm going to go back to another, I'm going to start with the original one that I started with. And I'm going to add one cell here and show what happens with this one. So this one also oscillates in a different way. It actually regenerates every 4 generations, it recreates itself, only one cell over and one cell down. They actually have a name for that too. It's called a glider. You can have a bigger this is an example of a little bigger glider. This one's like a spaceship. Instead of moving downwards across the screen, it will scroll horizontally. In theory, this should be an infinite size screen. I'm only using 20 by 24 because that's all I need to really demo how this concept works. I did not really do any boundary conditions. This sort of works for horizontal movement, but if you'll notice it's slowly moving up the screen, that's because I'm like looking at locations in memory rather than screen locations. It's just going horizontally in memory at this point. So you can do one of three things with boundary conditions. You can pretend all the cells off the screen are dead. So I'm taking the original shape here and I'm just adding one cell underneath. You'll see this one will be a lot more interesting than the other ones we've seen so far. This one on a normal screen where they're infinite size or they're doing boundary checking, this pattern will take 1100 generations before it stabilizes. And you can see some parts will stabilize until some other parts may come down and blow them up again. So that one just blew up. And that one blew up, and so did that one over there, and the last one. So, and now it finally stabilized. So this one takes 1100 cycles to stabilize. And that's a simple pattern with just 5 cells. The smallest amount of cells that will generate infinitely is this pattern here. And no, I didn't find this out on myself. There's actually whole websites that have all these different patterns you can try. So this is just 10 cells. In theory, this one is the smallest one that will generate infinitely, but it won't happen on my screen again because I didn't do any check to the borders. So how you treat the borders, you either can treat them as all the cells around the border being off, or you could treat them as wrapping around the screen, sort of like it does on that one horizontal. So this one obviously did not go infinite, stabilized pretty fast. And this is another interesting one that will grow a pretty long time. And so the thing the thing that makes this most interesting, there's a lot of web pages you can find, and some people have created all kinds of really neat machines actually out of this. Like they will create ones that shoot gliders across the screen, or all kinds of interesting things. So just real quick, I'm going to show the main thing for how this works. I have a couple of variables. This will, for any given point in memory, it'll check how many of the 8 cells are active, how many neighbors it has, and this is just a counter that loops through the memory. First, I turn off the hashtag cursor, and then I go into a loop where I will take the contents of screen memory and dump 480 bytes into a byte array that's 480 big. I then have, that's the old screen. I have a 480 byte array for the new screen. If the color was orange on one time around, it'll be green on the next time around. And then this one loops through all 480 bytes in the screen memory, gets a count of the neighbors for that byte in memory. And you can see this is the rules, right? If there's 3 neighbors, then whether it was dead or alive, it will be alive. If it has 2 or 3 neighbors, or if it has less than 2 neighbors or more than 3, it will die no matter what it was before. And if it was blank, so this is for 3 neighbors, this is for less than 2, this is for greater than 3. So these last 2 checks for if there's 2. If it's dead, it stays dead, else it stays alive. And then once I've got the new screen all filled up, I move it back to the screen. And then I do that until I hit the option key on the Atari. And that is Conway's Game of Life. I would urge people to actually look into this. It's a very interesting, there's actual interview on YouTube with Conway about the whole contest and how it came about. There's a whole Wikipedia page. There's plenty of web pages with all kinds of patterns. What I would do on this, I think to improve it before I did the borders, was use a higher screen resolution on the Atari to widen the screen. And that's my presentation for today.